In August 2004, two young lovers grabbed their backpacks, followed their dreams, and headed out into the Australian sun. Their plan was simple: have new experiences, make new friends, and create new memories that would last a lifetime. But little did they know that only one of them would return home, and this adventure of a lifetime would turn into one of cold-blooded murder. Welcome back to Coffeehouse Crime, folks. My name is Adrian, and today we're looking at the case of Simone Strobel. Now, before I hand you my coffee, and just to let you know that I post true crime and strange cases here weekly, so if that is your sort of thing, please consider subscribing to the channel. And with that said, please grab yourself a coffee, pull up a seat, and get ready for the deep dive. This is the case of Simone Strobel. Today we're heading back to a country that is one of my personal favourites, and as many of you may know by now, that is Australia. The main part of our case today takes place in a small city named Lismore, located in New South Wales. Found around 30 kilometres or 18 miles away from Australia's eastern coastline, Lismore rests on the Wilson River and has around 28,000 residents. In contrast to most of Australia, the climate here is classed as humid subtropical, with mild to warm temperatures all year round. Storms and heavy rainfall are quite frequent here, which alongside steady humidity often causes flooding in the local area. Now, this was particularly awful in 1974 when water levels rose to a frightening 12 metres in height, and to this day, flooding occurs quite regularly. Saying that, Lismore is packed to the brim with outdoor activities, and with several sports clubs, bowling clubs and golf parks, there is plenty to choose from. With Australia's rugged outback, beautiful coastlines, jaw-dropping rainforests, and gorgeous metropolitan areas, it is no wonder that so many tourists make it their goal to visit or at least explore the country at least once in their lifetime, with backpacking one of the most popular ways to get around. One of those travelling around Australia in 2004 was Simone Strobel. Simone was a German citizen, born on September 20th, 1979 in Rieden, Germany, which is a small municipality found not far from Würzburg. Living there with her parents and her brother Alexander, Simi, which her loved ones liked to call her, was described as sweet and kind-hearted. And although not much is known about her background, she loved the outdoors and was passionate about staying active. As an adult in 2004, Simone was a 25-year-old teacher who enjoyed working with kids. She was a nurturing woman who loved stability, and this was reflected in her long-term relationship of over 6 years. Her partner, Tobias, was 1 year her junior. They had met in their teenage years, and supposedly it was love at first sight, and Simone was even considered to be a second daughter to Tobias's parents. Family and friends described their relationship as wonderful. Of course, they were lovers, but they were also best friends. Now, Tobias and Simone also shared a very common dream that many of us have in our 20s, to travel far away and explore new and interesting lands. They were earnest about executing this dream too, so much so that in August of 2004 they finally embarked on their journey. And after saying goodbye to their families and friends, they embarked on the 30-hour plane trip to Australia, officially marking the beginning of their travels together. Touching down in Sydney, they rented a van and started to explore the country on their own accord. And to help with finances along the way, and grant a visa extension, they also worked on nearby farms and on plantations. Even though they moved all over the place, Simone kept in regular contact with her family. She shared pictures and messages with them daily, and through these images it became very apparent that she was having the time of her life. To begin with, the holidays went by without any problems whatsoever, and 4 months later, in January 2005, they travelled up north to Brisbane. During this time, Tobias' sister Katrin and a mutual friend named Jens had both travelled from Germany to Australia, and of course this was to experience the Australian summer. I mean, you can't really blame them. Swapping the harsh winter for sand and sun is the ultimate way to beat the winter blues, and now all four could travel together. Come February the 11th, the group had driven from Queensland down to Lismore Central Park found in New South Wales, and while here they planned to stay at a caravan site for a few days. Where Tobias and Simone arranged to sleep in their own caravan, the other two would sleep in a tent located next to them, and over the following 3 days, the four of them would settle in quite nicely. At least up until this point in time, the group seemed relaxed enough to make friends with all the other campers. And by the time the evening rolled around, the entire extended group decided to go to a local pub named the Golan Hotel. Now, unfortunately, alcohol seemed to get in the way, and while the group were here, an argument broke out between them, and it escalated so far that, eventually, even the bar staff had to get involved and kick the four of them out. Some say that you should never separate a man and his beer, and for Tobias, yeah, that pretty much rang true. He had just ordered a new one when he was kicked out, and was quite visibly annoyed by this. At 11:05 PM, a surveillance camera outside the bar captured the four of them being kicked out, and in this footage, Tobias can be seen insulting the security guard. The atmosphere between the four seemed to be extremely tense. Tobias and Simone appeared to be arguing, and just moments later, it seems that Katrin and Jens took his side. Now, this footage will become particularly crucial to this case. As it turns out, this would be the last time Simone was ever recorded on camera, and only 2 hours later, she vanished without a trace. Now, according to the rest of the group, the four of them then decided to turn in for the night and returned back to the campsite. But despite the long walk home with some fresh air, it didn't seem to improve the mood of the group. Their conflict continued back at the caravan site, and allegedly, after a more heated discussion, Simone walked out of the campsite to calm down. Now, we can all agree that this is probably the best solution for de-escalating an argument. Building distance from a problem and taking a moment to breathe allows us to gain clarity and see the wood from the trees. But Simone had left the area so abruptly that she had left her phone and even her shoes behind. Maybe the phone can be seen as out of character, but going without any shoes was seen as incredibly bizarre. With every hour that passed by, the rest of the group became further concerned, and 7 hours later, when sunrise arrived, they knew that something was very, very wrong. They eventually searched the entire campsite, asking if anyone had seen her, but unfortunately, these efforts came back fruitless as no one had, and by 7 AM, the group were concerned enough to inform authorities. Now, this is where our story gets a little foggy, but multiple witness reports which were given to the police did not line up with what Simone's friends had told them. One witness claimed that after Simone disappeared, only Katrin and Jens seemed to be searching for her, whereas Tobias idly sat at the campsite. And another witness reported that, around midnight, he had heard people loudly arguing with each other from where the group was staying. This of course backing up reports that the group was not in a positive frame of mind when she disappeared. Dialing back to Germany, Tobias made the difficult call back to Simone's parents to tell them that she was missing, and no surprise, they were distraught to hear the news. In an effort to try and understand why she went missing, they immediately asked him if there was any sort of argument or fighting, in which Tobias oddly said no, which in hindsight was extremely suspicious. The family was so concerned about their daughter that her brother Alexander jumped on the next flight to Australia in an effort to help find his missing sister. Now, I know it's cliche to say, but for Simone to just jump up and disappear was extremely out of character, and the family had a very bad feeling about this. Now, unfortunately, the authorities did not take this case seriously to begin with. For this campsite in particular, it was not unusual for guests to meet up and smoke weed and other questionable substances. So, from experience, they knew that people often took off, disappeared for a period of time, and would then later return. They expected Simone's disappearance to follow this typical trend, but by the third day, there was still no sign of her. And so New South Wales police decided it was finally time to investigate and dig deeper. Several leads were followed, and multiple officers were assigned to search the surrounding area, and by February the 17th, 3 days since she disappeared, they had found a body. Unfortunately, due to the tropical and humid climate, it was already in a progressive state of decomposition. But after a DNA sample was taken from it, along with a DNA sample from her toothbrush, the news wasn't good. It was confirmed to be the body of Simone Strobel.
Have identified a body found on the state's north coast last week as that of missing German backpacker Simone Strobel. The German tourist was last seen outside Byron Bay's Great Northern Hotel 10 days ago. Her body was found last Thursday in the nearby city of Lismore, close to a caravan park where she'd been staying. Police used dental records to positively identify the body as that of Miss Strobel. They're still waiting on the results of a post-mortem examination.
But whoever had done this had made a very limited effort to cover the results of their actions, as her body was found only 100 meters from the campsite. She was naked and with palm fronds loosely concealing her. Authorities investigating the scene assumed that she had died from asphyxiation, likely from a pillow or a plastic bag. And oddly, there were no signs of a struggle or a fight. Neither were there any suggestions for a motive, such as robbery or sexual assault. And so, the big questions were, first of all, who was responsible for this? And second of all, why? Friends and family back home in Germany were devastated, and the people of Lismore were in total shock and disbelief that something so horrific could happen in their community. On February the 22nd, a vigil was held next to the crime scene. Katrin, Jens, Tobias and Simone's brother Alexander attended this, alongside hundreds from the Lismore community. Meanwhile, in Würzburg, a church service was held in her honour. After this, the volatility and pain that Simone's death created began to simmer, but not with any tangible result, because several months later, authorities still had no idea who killed her, and they had no leads at all. It was later in the year that German private investigators decided to fly to Australia to support local police. But even after more than a dozen interrogations, nothing new or fresh came to light. There was, however, one person who was mentioned over and over again to the authorities, and perhaps no surprise, that was her partner Tobias. What was odd is that, even in his own interviews with police, Tobias denied any fighting or arguing with Simone, and he always shared the same information with them, that the relationship was both solid and harmonious. This video, taken just after her murder, confirmed this.
So was it an argument between yourself and Simone?
No, I had nothing. Why you ask me these questions on 5 times?
Did you kill Simone Strobel?
No, never. Why should I kill my girlfriend?
Over the following months preceding her death, Tobias stopped talking to authorities entirely, a move which put him even more into the police's spotlight. In fact, Tobias would eventually disappear himself. He travelled to South Africa, where he worked as a bartender and surfing instructor under an entirely different new name. We all know that everyone deals with grief differently, but if you were in Tobias's innocent position, wouldn't you want your girlfriend's murder to be solved? And therefore, wouldn't you cooperate as much as possible to help catch her killer? As time passed, Tobias became the subject of much of the media's attention, and this was all for a good reason too, considering the surveillance footage, the argument back at the campsite, the contradicting stories, and now his total silence. According to Jens, who by the way was the only one to return to Australia for a hearing, the first 3 weeks of the holiday was amicable, with any and all arguments being short-lived. But by February the 9th, something seemed to have changed between Simone and Tobias, and the two would never speak to each other. If they did, it would end in arguing. In some of these arguments, it became evident that Tobias was extremely angry and resentful, and although he never became physically violent, you could tell that he was furious. And to add to this, on the day that Simone went missing, Tobias was drinking much more than usual, and the more that he drank, the more aggressive he became. As we know, this behaviour got himself and the group kicked out of the pub, and after returning back to the campsite, Jens claimed that he and Simone started to argue. And of course, at the very end of this argument, Simone Strobel disappeared. Searches continued into the early morning, and by 11 AM, authorities had been notified. Jens claimed that the reason the group started to pack up was so they could leave as soon as Simone returned, an event that unfortunately never happened. Interestingly enough, Jens also claimed that Tobias was adamant that they rehearsed their story for the police. He also demanded that they should not mention the weed, the beers, or the arguments. Not very typical behaviour of a person with nothing to hide. Jens wasn't happy with the idea, and furthermore, when police asked him if he believed Tobias could have killed her, he said, "I don't know, I've known him for a long time. I could not imagine him being capable of such a thing, but I admit that, on the day of her disappearance, I'd never seen this aggressive side of him before. That was completely new for me." The diaries left behind by Simone and Tobias back up Jens' statement. 2 days before her disappearance, both of them wrote that they were annoyed by each other and were not on speaking terms. But moving forward, the road to delivering justice became a prolonged and painstaking one for everyone involved. One case analyst suggested that, perhaps, more than one person could have been involved, as Simone's body showed no signs that she had tried to defend herself. Either way, there was no sufficient evidence to point the finger at any individual conclusively, therefore making any arrests impossible. And although Tobias and Katrin continued to remain silent to the rest of the world, both Germany and Australia refused to forget about Simone's death. But as the years passed by, Simone's murder eventually fell into the category of cold cases, and only endless discussions, TV reports, and even a book about her kept the case alive. We're jumping forward several years. By 2014, 9 years since her death, the Bavarian Office of Criminal Investigations announced a $10,000 reward for any information that would lead to an arrest or conviction. And 6 years later, on October 15th, 2020, Australian authorities raised the stakes by announcing a $1 million reward, the equivalent of £550,000, or $675,000 US. Although Simone's dream to live in Australia had died with her, it seems that Tobias had got what he wanted. By 2020, he had moved to Perth, found a new partner, changed his name, married, and had 2 children. Now, just to clarify, if Tobias was innocent, he did deserve to eventually move on with his life, especially after 17 years. But according to investigators, that doesn't appear to be the case. Because on July the 26th, 2022, Tobias's world came crashing down, and his past actions finally caught up with him.
Police have issued arrest warrants for 2 German women following the murder of a 25-year-old backpacker on the state's north coast 17 years ago. The victim's former Australian boyfriend has now been charged with her murder and was extradited from Perth overnight to face a Sydney court.
Tobias Moran is tonight behind bars in Sydney, leaving behind his new life and new family. His alleged dark past catching up with him.
Tobias, what have you been doing for the last 20 years?
The 42-year-old, who's been living in Perth with his pregnant wife and 2 children, was extradited last night. He's now charged with killing his then-girlfriend Simone Strobel 17 years ago.
Tobias, do you have anything to say to Simone's family?
The German couple had been backpacking with Moran's sister Catherine and friend Jens Martin when Simone disappeared from a Lismore caravan park. Her body was found 6 days later. Moran has always claimed he's innocent, but in 2007 refused to return to Australia for an inquest.
In July 2022, Tobias Moran, who was formerly known to be Tobias Suckfuell, was arrested in his home in Perth by Strikeforce detectives. He appeared in court the very next day, and was remanded in custody pending extradition to New South Wales, where he would then face court proceedings in Sydney. Shortly after his extradition, he was then charged with murder and attempting to pervert the course of justice. In addition to this, further arrest warrants were issued for Catherine Suckfuell and Jens Martin, in relation to allegations of being accessories to concealment of the crime after it was committed. Interesting side note here, but back at the crime scene, one single strand of blonde hair had been found next to Simone. The hair was rootless, meaning forensics had only one shot at testing the strand, but Tobias, he had blonde hair. Which may not sound substantial, but when you realise that only 2% of the population has it, that does tend to whittle down the suspects quite generously. In 2005, DNA tests were nowhere near as advanced as they are now, and it's not confirmed if this specific hair led to his arrest or not, but at least the media highly speculates it. It is now speculated that Tobias strangled Simona in the van after their heated argument, before then taking her clothes off and dragging her into the outback with the assistance of another person. Now, Tobias still denies it, and also says that police have no valid evidence, and to everyone's despair, he was then granted bail and transferred back home. The magistrate said that the prosecution's case was not the strongest, and to this very day, he continues to remain silent as he awaits trial. Catherine and Jens were also requested to be extradited from Germany. However, it has since emerged that German magistrates refused the deal due to a lack of sufficient evidence. Now, understandably, authorities have kept recent case progressions under wraps, but as this story moves forward, I'll be sure to let you know. And by the way, there are 2 ways you can keep up to date. You can either wait for the video to be released here, or follow my social media for more and quicker updates. Now, as always, here are some unique side notes to the story. Back in 2005, a random stranger confessed and even bragged about murdering Simona, but it turns out he was only crying for attention, and eventually he was ruled out as a suspect. After accidentally bumping into Catherine in the city, Alexander asked her what happened to his sister, in which Catherine responded by running away. And after returning home to Germany, Tobias seemed to be rather stoic to everyone involved. And when Simone's parents asked him if they could have her guitar back, he responded by saying, "There is nothing to share from your daughter anymore." As you can likely imagine, this case is now picking up serious heat after many years in the cold case files, and hopefully it'll be solved soon. Personally, I am watching this case very vigilantly. As a man who has travelled around Australia and has German connections, this one hits closer than most. And no matter the verdict, I am sure that Simona will always be very fondly remembered. Following her death, locals placed flowers in the spot that she was found, and a small monument was built in her memory. Personally speaking, I share many of the same hopes and dreams that she once felt. Travelling around and exploring Australia holds some of the best memories I've ever experienced, and to think that a time so sacred and valued was met with death is a tragedy I can't seem to wrap my head around. In an interview with local media, Simona's father said, "We are totally surprised and need to collect ourselves. We have awaited answers for 17 years. 17 years of grief, anger, sadness, uncertainty and desperation." And although her parents were able to lay Simona to rest, it still is an incomplete chapter in their lives. Her parents still keep pictures of her around the entire house, and still remember her vividly. They have also distanced themselves from Catherine and Tobias when they eventually realised how suspicious they behaved. Two families who once used to support each other are now estranged clans with shattered trust. Tobias, Catherine and Jens have all distanced themselves from social media. Their ongoing silence grows into a continually louder one, as the world places them under ever-increasing scrutiny, desperate for an answer and for justice after all this time. We don't quite know what Jens and Catherine are doing these days, but between them and Tobias, all three are continuing with their lives as usual. For now. Now, it is worth mentioning here that all three are innocent until proven guilty and should not be contacted or harassed. So we'll have to see what happens in the future, but I hope Simone's family can move through this with as little pain as possible. So I think I'm wrapping this one up here today, folks, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this case. Do you think that Simone was murdered by these three people? Or do you think this was a red herring? Thank you so much for watching another video today by Coffeehouse Crime, and as always, you know what to do. If you found this case interesting, please remember to like the video, and if you haven't yet, please consider subscribing to the channel. But until you and I see each other again, please remember to look after yourself, look out for each other, and of course, stay safe. Thank you, and goodbye.